One of the main mills that still exists today is this one, Kirby's Mill. And because it is the only last operational mill, it is extremely important to the history of Burlington County.
It's a 220-year-old facility, so it has historical significance. It's part of an industry that was very vibrant in New Jersey. Plus, it was a mainstay of the area and provided jobs for people.
The water wheel excites people. People are interested in seeing the motion of the wheel and seeing the transfer of the energy from the wheel to the shafts, to the gearing, to the stones.
People can come here and learn the 300-year history of Burlington County by visiting this mill and seeing its operations. Back in 1677 and 1678, 4 ships came down the Delaware and landed in Burlington, present-day Burlington City. They were the Kent, the Willing Mind, the Martha, and the Shield. They landed on the banks of the Delaware, and the 1,000 settlers were to begin colonization of Burlington County. These Quakers eventually, within about 15 years, began forming out plantations. The first one was in the village of Rancocas. In addition to the development of the communities along the north branch of the Rancocas, settlers began moving in now on the south branch and coming to a village called Vincenttown. And there Joseph Burr set up a sawmill and a grist mill. And then they started settling in another area, the southwest branch of the Rancocas, and that's what brings us to Kirby's Mill. As county historian, I'm very interested in Kirby's Mill because it is symbolic and the last vestige, really, of the early history of Burlington County. And so people can come here and learn the 300-year history of Burlington County by visiting this mill and seeing its operations.
The original Haynes family bought this area in 1679 before the mill was built.
The original family that bought the parcel of ground that the mill was built on was John Haynes, and that was back in 1679. He was one of the first settlers in Medford. It was said that John, when he first came here, actually lived in a bank, in a cave, in one of the creeks that fed the Rancocas. And he purchased what is now called the Friendship Tract, which was about 2,240 acres of ground in this area. And he built his first home, which is on Fostertown Road, which is the original house, which is still there. It included the property that is now associated with the mill and land from the creek all the way almost to Branch Street in Medford. But the people that actually petitioned the state of New Jersey to build a dam was his grandson, Jonathan Haynes, his son Isaac, and another person by the name of Samuel Phillips. So they were the original people that started the process of building this establishment.
They started construction in the early 1770s. They had petitioned to the government to construct a dam on the branch of the Rancocas Creek to provide power for a water wheel.
The first mill was 1778. Haynes built the first mill here, but the current mill we're in is 1830. We have no exact documentation of the original building, but undoubtedly it was a small one-story mill. The only thing we have, which probably is from the original mill, are some hand-hewn timbers that were used over again in this mill back in the corner.
The next owner was Nehemiah Haynes, and he inherited half of the mill in 1787. At that point, Samuel Phillips had passed away, and Nehemiah purchased the remaining half of the mill from the widow, and he became the next complete owner of the mill. He's the person that actually built the miller's house, which is across the street from the mill, which is also part of the complex. The next owner of the mill, Charles, his father Nehemiah, died in 1805. And from 1805 until 1861, the sons ran the mill very profitably for that entire period of time. They put the mill up for sale, and the mill was sold after 87 years of operation by the Haynes family. The next several owners, and there's a little conjecture here as to how many, but it seemed approximately 3 owners over a period of time of a little over 10 years, operated the mill with no success, and the mill became very run down before the next major owner of the mill came about. William G. Kirby purchased the mill in 1877 for $5,000, and he was in partnership with his younger brother, Charles. They operated the mill for several years and did some major renovations to the mill. They added on to the mill complex. They built the warehouse across the street, and they did other major modifications to the mill to make it more productive. It was at that point that they expanded, and Charles took over a new location on Main Street in town, and William stayed and operated the mill at Kirby's Mill. Kirby's Mill is owned by the Medford Historical Society. When the Kirbys put this up for sale, I think it included approximately 64 acres of ground. Most of that ground is still owned by the township, which would include where the ball field is, where the sewer plant is, and things of that nature.
The Historical Society bought this from the Kirby brothers in 1969. The purchase price was $12,500. It was covered with spider webs, dust, dirt. The first several months was just a matter of mucking out the areas in order to get at them, to brush them down and sweep them down.
When the society first took the mill over, they did the work that needed to be done to stabilize it. Tore down some of the structures that were not worth saving and took off some appendages which didn't apply to the plan for restoration.
The intention of our restoration was to bring the mill back to 1850, the era of the first metal or steel water wheels.
The mill was still an operable mill and had very good timbers, which you can still see exist today, but much of the exterior facade was deteriorating badly and needed a good bit of restoration to stabilize the building and keep it from getting any worse.
Also at that time, there were chutes that carry the corn and the product from upstairs to downstairs. Most of these were taken out so that you had room to walk from one end of the mill to the other. There was a loading canopy. That was torn off, the siding repaired and cleaned up. The sluice trough was totally rebuilt. There were still turbines in the water under the mill. Where the water wheel was actually a covered shed, and the water flow came through the sluice, under the mill, through the turbines, and then back out. When we got into the major construction of the water wheel and that section of it, we actually tore off that whole outside shed, put in a cofferdam, and drained that whole area, dug it out, had a contractor come in and pour a concrete cement foundation and the retaining wall that supports the other side of the wheel.
Turbines, even though they're more functional for production, they're not very good for demonstrating milling processes. They're underwater, you can't see them, all you can see is a shaft spinning around, and whereas the water wheel excites people. People are interested in seeing the motion of the wheel and seeing the transfer of the energy from the wheel to the shafts, to the gearing, to the stones, and whatnot. The old original wheel gearing had long since been destroyed and wouldn't be usable anyway, because undoubtedly it was all wooden gearing. the necessity to make patterns for all the gearing and then have the gears poured and have the shafts turned out all required a good bit of money, and it took quite a while to raise it.
The foundation that supports the millstones and the gearing for the water wheel are separate from the building. So as the stones cause a vibration, it does not affect the rest of the mill. It's actually a separate platform that all of the gearing and the stones sit on. And that was all done by 4 or 5 of us, amateur volunteers with come-alongs, pry bars, rollers, and it's amazing what a bunch of old retired duffers accomplished when you look at the cellar down there.
Since then, we've had a number of other projects. The blacksmith shop is all restored, put in a demonstration sawmill. We have a great number of tools on display throughout the mill. We have a cabinet maker's shop and a cooper's shop. And on the second floor, there's some exhibits which are still being put in. One is a country store. The other is a dressmaker's shop, which goes back into the 1800s. So there's no end to the work to be done. We're currently putting a new roof on. The roof that's on here has been here 100 years, and it's seeing the last of its life. Part of the process of maintaining the old look is maintaining the wood shingles under the new roof that's being put on. The current roof is a steel roof on the old original wood shingles, and we want to maintain that appearance. At the same time, we've been working on putting a water tank on the roof, and we have the tank already and the platform already and the new stanchion for it all built.
This will be a non-water filled, just the shell of a water tower to give it the same silhouette and look that it had back in the early 1900s.
The mill operated as a one-story mill originally, and everything was handled by hand at that time. They had to do the grinding and the sifting and the bagging all on one floor, and they would be dragging bags around all the time. Later, when they went to 3 floors, they had to eventually automate to save the manpower, which they did by Oliver Evans coming through in 1850 and automating practically all the mills on the eastern seacoast of the United States, where they would assign one of the turbines to driving all the automatic equipment like the hopper boy and the strainers, and they got to the point where one man could operate the mill at night. After they got it all set up, they usually operated on 12-hour shifts. The daylight guys, 2 or 3 of them, would set the whole mill up, so then all the man had to do would start it up, the operator, and just watch the quality of the flour coming off of the stones and continually watching it with his thumb and palm of his hand to make sure that stones never touched. To be a good miller is an art you had to acquire after many years. The farmer brought his grain to the outside of the building where it was lowered through a chute to the basement into a bin. From the bin, there were canvas belts with buckets on them, and they would pick up the grain and take it up to the 3rd floor where it went through a cleaner where the kernels of the wheat were separated from the stems and from anything that was undesirable from making flour. From the 3rd floor then, it went down to the 2nd floor, and the whole 2nd floor of the mill was nothing more than large bins where they would store the wheat or the grain until they could get around to grinding it. The problem came that the set of stones would only do about maybe 80 bushel a day. But in the first 2 weeks in July, you have all your grain in all over the farms coming ripe, and it had to be cut. So the reason why mills were so large and why they had to have a 2nd floor was to store wheat. The grain was lowered down chutes to the stones where it was ground, and it would come off the stones and go down to the basement to another bin where there was another belt with some more buckets. It would take it back up to the 3rd floor again, where they had what they called the hopper boy. A rake-like beam would go around and would stir it and cool it. Grain comes off the stones fairly hot, and if you don't cool it off, you can't put it through the strainers because it gets gummy. It would then fall down a hole in the middle of that hopper boy and taken over to the strainers, where was a large cylindrical type of strainers, about 2 feet in diameter, 10 feet long, and they'd have very fine cloth, very fine silk cloth, and then a little coarser, then a little coarser, and then the bran. Then it would drop down to this first floor where it was put into bags and subsequently shipped out. So therefore, if you were to follow 1 grain of wheat through this mill, you'd be to the cellar, to the 3rd floor, to the 2nd floor, to the 1st floor, to the cellar, to the 3rd floor, to the 2nd floor, to the 1st floor. The first cut of the flour would drop off the very good white fine flour where it was used for bread, and they had middlings that wasn't quite so good, and then they got down to the tailings and the bran, and they used to call it ship stock. They called it ship stock because it was poor quality, and they sold it to shippers who wouldn't know how bad it was until they got out to sea. When we start up, we'll probably have a lot of trouble, and we'll probably have stones hitting stones, and we'll have pieces of stones in our corn that we grind, but we're not going to sell it, so that's all right.
When they first bought this in 1969, one of the first things that the Historical Society did was to apply for historic registers with the federal government and part of the state and federal recognition of a historic site. And that was originally granted and named a historic site in 1971.
In order to get a title as a National Historic Site, you have to have a facility that has historic significance either by architecture or function, and this particular one has both. It's not just the building that is the mill, it's also the storage barn across the street, the restored blacksmith shop, the little building on the other side that the miller that attended to this building lived at, and also the miller's house itself. So the entire site is part of that award.
To be placed on the National Register is important for a number of reasons. It documents the importance of this as a historic site and opens up avenues to perhaps tourism and other various things of historic interest. I think it's unique because it has not changed tremendously over the years. There's been additions and improvements, but the original mill, the original timbers, the stones, the burr stones, and the gearing that turns the wheels, the stone shafts, and the rinds and the drivers are original and has a lot of importance that way.
It's a 220-year-old facility. It's part of an industry that was very vibrant in New Jersey and other towns as far as producing products. Plus, it was a mainstay of the area and provided jobs for people. And it was the last operating mill in the state of New Jersey, which makes it extremely significant.
The mill currently has 4 open to the public, free activities that are the backbone of what we do for the community or within the community. Our first one is in early June. We have a quilt show, and we'll have 120, 130 quilts that are hung and displayed in the mill. The next one is in July. We have what we call Country Day, and we have old farm equipment, farm machinery. We display various activities that the farmer was involved in 100 years ago. We operate the sawmill, the blacksmith shop is open. We have a Civil War encampment. We have cooking over an open hearth fireplace. The next one is in early August, an art show, and there's art for sale and art by local artists. Then the big activity is the Apple Festival, the 2nd Saturday in October. You can get apple donuts, apple cider, apple pies, apple strudel, you name it, and if it's got apples, we can sell it. And the sale of our apple goodies, we can cover expenses and sometimes make as much as $10,000 or $12,000. That money goes towards the restoration and the upkeep of the mill. Hopefully, my grandchildren and their grandchildren can still come and see an operating, or at least an existing grist mill, and learn something about our forefathers, the accomplishments they had, and the conditions that they lived under.
Visitors come here. It's open every Sunday afternoon in the summer. We have our festivals. It's sort of a showplace for Medford.
All of us have a very real love for the building and the site. And we're very proud of how much has been accomplished here.